Hey gamers, Maniac here with GameAccess.net, doing a new type of video. This is a video series that we haven't done in quite a while. As I was doing some of my lost media videos, I had been doing research upon several different stories that I'm familiar with, and I realized that I had a lot of stories that I can share with you guys, a lot of stories that I could tell you guys, and none of them would fall under lost media, but one of these stories I thought of sure would make a really good fail, I thought. And how? What I'm about to tell you is a story of one of the most shrewd business deals that was ever made, that probably had one of the biggest impacts in the world of technology that we are still dealing with today. If this story hadn't played out the way that I'm about to describe it, then basically everything would be different. Everything that we know could have been different. I would not be able to even do this video with this equipment, with this stuff, because none of it would probably exist. So sit back, relax, and let me tell you this story. We're going to start off by telling a story about a man named Steve Jobs. Yes, that's Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs was the co-founder of Apple. Yep, them. And throughout the 70s and 80s, Apple was always releasing desktop computers, a whole new series of desktop computers. And by the early 80s, Jobs was poised onto a team at Apple that was designed to, or that his plan was to release a new type of desktop computer that would just wipe not only all desktop computers just completely off the market, but probably make all of the other desktop computers Apple was offering completely obsolete at the same time. This was going to be his power play. This was going to be his big project. This was going to be his Mona Lisa. And of course, it was called the Macintosh. Now, the Macintosh is not the fail. I would be an idiot if I said fail. No, that is not what this video is about. Apple fanboys, please don't at me. What is this video about? Well, there are two stories that are basically going on at this time. I just told you about Steve Jobs, but let's be honest about this. Steve Jobs was not a saint. And according to many of the anecdotes that I've been hearing about him over the years, many of which I actually believe, he was a passionate guy. He was a driven guy. You could say he was a dreamer. You could say he was an artist. He was a man. And he was a man that was flawed. And I understand that he can't be around to defend himself. May he rest in peace. I understand that. But there were reports of him being bad for Apple morale at the time, because he was known to pit divisions against each other, to curse out and yell at people. In fact, there's even anecdotes that he at one point yelled and screamed at Bill Gates once, at least once. So, as to how true that is, I don't know. But that was probably in the background of Mike Scully, of basically the guy who was in charge of Apple at the time. A man who used to work for Pepsi, a man who Steve Jobs actually convinced to work for Apple, fired him. And Steve Jobs was let go of at Apple. And that became a big pushpin moment in this story. Apple, of course, would continue on with the Macintosh product line without Steve Jobs, through several events, several hardware cycles. New revisions of the Mac operating system were released over the time. Some of that was given with new hardware. But Apple, for a while, pressed on without Steve Jobs. Now, I told you that story to tell you a separate story. In the late to mid-90s, in the mid to late 90s, there was another major hardware company at the time that not a lot of people remember. And that was, of course, Palm. Now, what was Palm? For those of you who don't know what Palm is, Palm was a portable computer company that released we would consider nowadays modern day smartphones, but these weren't what they were releasing was not modern day smartphones. The technology just wasn't there. You got to take into account that by the mid to late 90s, there were only two ways to use the internet while you were there. There was only two ways to use the internet. One was you would have a desktop computer at home, or if you were lucky enough, you could have a laptop computer that you could travel with. That was it. And the only way to get those things online was either to connect to a high-speed network, which were not common at the time, or plug your computer into the phone line and dial into the internet that way. And if you were not at home, then you'd have to plug into the phone line of your hotel or your buddy's house or your grandparents' house or something in order to get online. And hopefully you know the local numbers for your ISP. But when the Palm came out, the Palm offered more options. This was a device that was about the same size as a modern day smartphone. It was a monochrome screen. It ran on, AA or AAA batteries. I can't remember. But it was a philosophy behind it that actually meets today's philosophies for modern day smartphones. It was a portable computer. They were called portable digital assistants, PDAs for short. But the idea behind them was that they could do what you needed to do while you were on the go before you needed to basically hold you off until you can get to a computer, meaning your desktop or your laptop computer. You could download applications to it. You could keep things like your calendar information, your address book, your notes. You could even write, depending on in later models, send and receive emails, which was a big deal at the time. This was this was the late 90s. Being able to send and receive email without a computer was huge at the time. Well, you weren't near a phone line even. So Palm was doing pretty well for themselves. They found a niche and they were making money in that niche. You couldn't make phone calls with them, but you could do other things. Basically it would be enough for you to tide over. But by the early 2000s, cell phones were really starting to drop in price and drop in size. And they could do a lot. So you now could get a Nokia phone from AT&T or T-Mobile or Verizon or something. And you could send and receive messages on that. It would work all across the country with cellular reception, and you could keep an address book on it, you could keep a calendar on it. You couldn't really do much else with it. You couldn't browse the internet or look at photos or anything. But you could, make and send phone calls, which for some people was enough. Especially it's like, well, I don't need email, but I do need to call this person. So it filled a niche. The problem was that was starting to eat on Palm's business, to say nothing of the fact that you had other major companies at the time that were seeing Palm's success, like major companies like Apple and Microsoft, and wanting to get a piece of that niche themselves. Apple, of course, released the Newton, and Microsoft was selling, stripped down versions of Windows to OEM manufacturers for small computers. Now, neither of those companies really did really well. I never can comment about the success of the Newton. I was fairly certain the Newton was far too overpriced to be useful in the market. But I do know I have heard pretty bad things about the Windows portable options at that time. Specifically, the fact that all I heard was it was slow. Yes, it had a better color. It had a color screen or offered color screens, but it was slow, and the batteries drained out pretty quickly. So there was that. So Palm was starting to get their bottom line nibbled at. And they needed more options. They needed new ways of making income. Now, they saw what Microsoft was doing, and they saw what Apple was doing. Microsoft's philosophy at the time was they were a software company. They were going to release software, sell it, or license it to hardware manufacturers for computers or other types of computing devices. And then those computing devices would get sold and people would become Windows users that way. Apple's philosophy was the opposite. They would make hardware and they designed software to run specifically on that hardware. Palm was of Apple's model, which was they released hardware and they designed software to work specifically with it. But then they realized maybe in the short term, maybe there would be more value if they decided to split their company in two and make both software and hardware and give consumers an option and basically like by licensing the Palm operating system to outside manufacturers, possibly having the hardware release on different types of operating systems like Windows PC or something, like have a Windows, release a Windows Palm or a Palm that could run the Windows operating system. But they would have to split up the company to succeed with that. So they did. The problem is just imagine what would happen if Apple decided to split themselves up as such a unified company. You had all these teams within Palm that were basically getting cut, experienced teams, dedicated teams that worked well, that were just getting cut right down the middle. They're not going to be as productive when with these qualified, experienced teams when they're broken up like that. They're just not going to be as productive as they were. And on top of that, the products that they were releasing were no longer in step with each other. Like Palm was working on a huge, major operating system. I think the term for it, I think it was Palm OS 6. And Palm was going all in that this was going to be the big deal. This was going to be the big operating system. This was going to revolutionize all operating systems. But it needed serious hardware to run it. Serious hardware that the Palm hardware company just hadn't caught up with yet. So in the interim, Palm Software decided to work on what was later called, I think, Palm OS 5. And the beautiful part about Palm OS 5 was that they could at least get it on some hardware as they waited for the hardware to be ready for Palm OS 6. But again, the companies were no longer in step with each other. And when people started realizing, oh, I don't have to buy a Palm handheld. I could just wait. Or I'll buy I'll buy a cell phone instead and wait and just use my laptop. Or why wait for Palm to release a new handheld, this great new handheld, when I can just buy a HP handheld that's running the Palm operating system? It's basically what I want anyway, or it's good enough for me. So you had all of these downsides to this decision. Downsides that maybe somebody had thought of at Palm, but obviously it wasn't, this was what was happening. And so Palm was essentially losing a lot of money. You had hardware that wasn't selling. You didn't have a lot of potential buyers for the software. And now the market was getting smaller and smaller because now laptops were starting to get wireless capabilities, like Wi-Fi was becoming a thing. So people could get smaller laptops. So things weren't looking too good for Palm software or Palm hardware for that matter. Let's step away from that for a second. Let's get back to Apple. Now, Apple was still pushing forward with the Mac computers. That was their main line of consumer PCs. But by the time they were hitting OS 8, Mac OS 8, the operating systems that they were developing were getting pretty long in the tooth. There were a lot of problems with them. Granted, backwards compatibility was a good thing, and I will totally stand by that. But there were problems. And when you basically been running an operating system based on code for so long, the problem is starting to become performance per use. In that your hardware can't run as well on the software because the software is bogged down by all of these, these old emulation calls and things like that. In fact, Windows to this day still has this problem. And so the idea came in that, well, what if we just scrap what we've done and just release a new product all from scratch? Let's rewrite a new Mac operating system and develop new Mac hardware to run it. And it would run faster than if we continue to develop on top of what we've already done. And then Apple realized, wait, does anybody have an operating system that we could use? And not really. I mean, there were some options that they had, but not everything was available to them. So they decided to start shopping around as to see what can they use, what was out there essentially that they could use as the basis for their next big Mac operating system. Essentially, they were searching for what would become the groundwork for what became OS X. Everybody who has a benefit of hindsight knows, my God, OS X, whatever was probably the basis for that, probably did very, very well financially, right? Yeah. OS X would later go on to become a huge success. So Apple sent their feelers out, and Palm Software was notified about it. And so Palm Software came in, and they did a demonstration of their big OS 6, I think it was, to Apple. And Apple was impressed, and Apple gave them a monetary offer. They said, we'll give you this many millions of dollars to buy your software and use it as the basis for what will become OS 10, OS X as we know it now. And Palm says, we want more. And that's where this story takes a turn. Apple tells Palm, we'll think about it. Of course, I'm paraphrasing the events. Now let's step back for a second from both of those stories. Steve Jobs, after he left Apple, did not just stay at home and retire. He went on to other ventures. Particularly, he went on to Pixar, and everybody knows the story about that. We're not going to go on further about that. But he also was working on a company called Next Step. Now, what was Next Step? Next Step was a professional computer development system, hardware system, which was basically like if Steve Jobs had been given unlimited money and told to do whatever he wanted at Apple, was probably the computer that he wanted to really make. He essentially wanted to make a really expensive, high-end professional workstation for professional users, for like artists and editors and all of that stuff. So, and software creators and everything. And he was successful with this. Well, I know that a lot of people aren't familiar with the Next Step hardware or the Next Step computers and the Next Step operating system. Amongst professionals, it was considered a creme de la creme option. In fact, a lot of people don't know this, but John Carmack was a huge fan of the Next Step computer. In fact, some of the original id Software games, like I think he developed Doom and Quake on them at least, were developed with Next Step hardware by John Carmack. He loved it. And I know this because I read him talking about it in Masters of Doom. This was a big deal. So what did it mean? What happened? Well, a couple of things. At the same time that Apple was looking at the Palm operating system to be the basis for OS X, they were also looking at Next Step and the next operating system for being the basis for OS X as well. And maybe in the back of their mind, Apple knew that if they bought Next Step, they would get Steve Jobs back. And at the time, from all reports I know, they really needed him back. Steve Jobs would eventually save the company. The company was like, I think they were 90 days from being done at the time he came in. He saved them. And so Apple decided, we're going to go with Next Step. We're not going to go with Palm. There's your fail. Palm saying, we want more from Apple. And Apple saying, we're going to go with Next Step instead. Steve Jobs comes back to Apple. He completely revolutionizes everything. Obviously, after he saves the company basically from bankruptcy, he then later goes on to release a bunch of really creative G3 and G4 computers. And then he releases, of course, the OS X computers, the OS X computers. And the rest is history, basically. Steve Jobs then later goes on, of course, to release the iPhone and the iPad and completely takes over the personal device market for handhelds. And now not too many people use computers at all anymore because our tablets and our phones are usually adequate enough to do that. Wow, what a big deal. Imagine if Apple had gone with the Palm's operating system as opposed to the Next Step operating system. Now, what was the ramifications for this undone deal for Palm software? Well, as far as I can tell, Palm really never recovered. Palm hardware certainly never recovered from this deal. Three things basically happened. One, the Palm operating system later got sold to a company called B, which is spelled BE, to be the foundation for an operating system called BOS, which, as far as I know, never really took off. The company, as far as I know, is defunct. I could be wrong about that, but I'm pretty certain that it is. And I know for a fact that B did not offer as much as the initial offer from Apple was. I can tell you that. Palm later got bought and sold. They tried to make a Palm hardware company tried making a smartphone entirely on their own. Nobody bought it because it came out too late. It was already competing against the iPhone and the Android operating system at the time. In a two-pronged market, they were trying to be three, and it did not work out for them. And the company got sold to Hewlett-Packard. They tried releasing a Hewlett-Packard branded tablet and phone device, which, again, also did not take off. And then the company, basically out of desperation, just open sourced the company and just open sourced the operating system that Palm had made. And that was basically the end of it. And that's probably why you can't get a decent foldable keyboard these days, because Hewlett-Packard bought, basically they were originally developed by Palm, and Hewlett-Packard now owns the patents to them. So, needless to say, fail all around, except, of course, for Steve Jobs. He returned to Apple, he saved the company, and now I can do this video on this phone with these earbuds. It's just really weird how things can change, how things happen. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Until next time, guys, my name is Maniac with GamingSuccess.net. Take care. Over and out.